The message had been playing for 300 years. Every ship that came close to human space heard the same words on every radio frequency in every known language. The message was simple. It said turn back and that this was the only warning. Most species in the galaxy listened. They turned their ships around and went home. They told stories about the strange humans who lived beyond the border and never came out. Some said humans were weak and hiding. Others said humans were dangerous and that the warning should be taken seriously. Nobody knew the truth because nobody had ever tested it. Admiral Jack stood on the bridge of his ship and looked at the large screen in front of him. He was 62 years old and had gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent his whole life in the Navy hoping that he would never see what he was seeing now. On the screen were red dots moving slowly toward human space. Each dot was an enemy ship. There were too many to count at first glance. Lieutenant Laura sat at her station and watched the same screen. She was young and had only been in the Navy for 5 years. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was beating fast. She had trained for this moment, but training was different from reality. She turned to the Admiral and spoke in a clear voice. She told him that the Dominion had crossed the boundary. She said there were 47 capital ships and over 200 support vessels. They were heading straight for the colony on New Portland. Jack closed his eyes for a moment and let the weight of those words sink into his chest. New Portland was a peaceful world with 12 million people living on it. There were families there, children, farmers and teachers and doctors who had never fired a weapon in their lives. They were coming to take that world and everyone on it. He opened his eyes and looked at his crew. Every face on the bridge was watching him and waiting for orders. He spoke quietly and told them to send the final warning. Communications Officer Daniel Hayes nodded and turned to his console. His fingers moved across the controls, and he transmitted the message that every human officer prayed they would never have to send. The message told them that they had entered human space and that they must withdraw immediately or face total destruction. It said there would be no negotiation and no mercy. It said this was not a threat but a fact. The message traveled across the void of space at the speed of light. It reached the flagship in seconds and appeared on the screen in front of Supreme Commander Orr. He was a tall creature with gray skin and 4 arms and mandibles that clicked when he spoke. He had conquered 17 worlds in his career and had never lost a battle. He read the human message and laughed. His officers watched him and waited for his response. One of them asked if they should slow down and assess the situation, or turned and looked at the officer with cold eyes. He said that humans had been hiding behind that same message for 300 years. He said they had no real military power and no real weapons. Their worlds were barely defended, and their population was small. The whole thing was a bluff designed to scare away anyone who came close. He ordered his fleet to continue forward and ignore the warning. The Dominion was a coalition of 7 different species that had joined together centuries ago. They had conquered half the galaxy and ruled over billions of beings. Their ships were powerful and their weapons were advanced. They had never met an enemy they could not defeat. The idea that a small, isolated species like humanity could stand against them was laughable. Or settled back in his command chair and watched the stars pass by on his. He thought about the glory that awaited him when he returned home with human worlds under his control. The Dominion Council would celebrate his victory. His name would be remembered for generations. He had no doubt that this would be an easy conquest. Far away on the bridge of his own ship, Admiral Jack watched the enemy fleet continue its advance. The final warning had been sent and ignored. He had done everything protocol required. Now there was only one thing left to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key on a chain. He had carried that key for 30 years, hoping he would never have to use it. His father had carried it before him, and his grandfather before that. He walked to a panel on the side of the bridge and inserted the key into a hidden lock. The panel slid open to reveal a single red button beneath a glass cover. The button had 3 words printed above it. The words said Last Resort Protocol. Laura watched him from her station. She had heard rumors about the button and what it meant, but she had never believed them. Everyone in the Navy had heard the stories. They said that humanity had built terrible weapons during the early days of space travel, weapons so powerful that they had been sealed away and hidden because humanity was ashamed of what they had created. Most people thought the stories were myths meant to scare new recruits. Jack lifted the glass cover and placed his finger on the button. He paused for a moment and thought about his granddaughter Amy, who served on another ship somewhere in the fleet. He thought about his wife who had passed away 10 years ago. He thought about all the people on New Portland who were counting on him to protect them. He pressed the button. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, something stirred. In hidden facilities across human space, lights flickered on in places that had been dark for 200 years. Machines that had been sleeping began to wake up. Ships that no one alive had ever seen began to power their engines. The galaxy was about to learn why no one crossed human space. And Supreme Commander, or, was about to learn that humanity had never been bluffing. He would not live long enough to tell anyone what he discovered. The facility had been sealed for 217 years. It was buried deep beneath a mountain range on Earth in a place that did not appear on any map. The entrance was hidden behind a waterfall and protected by security systems that no one remembered how to operate. The people who built it were long dead. The people who knew its secrets had taken those secrets to their graves. Dr. Palmer had spent her entire career studying old records from the early days of human space travel. She worked at the historical archives in a small office filled with dusty files and ancient computer drives. Most of her colleagues thought she was wasting her time. The early days of humanity in space were considered a dark period that most people preferred to forget. There had been wars and suffering and terrible things done in the name of survival. Modern humanity had moved past all of that. They were peaceful now, civilized. Had always suspected there was more to the story than the official records showed. There were gaps in the historical data, references to projects that had no details, mentions of facilities that had no locations. She had spent 20 years trying to piece together the puzzle, and she had come close to the truth several times. But the final pieces had always been missing. Until today. When Admiral pressed the button on his ship, a signal was sent to every hidden facility in human space. The signal contained a code that had not been used since the last solar war. The code was simple. It said, "Wake up." Was working late at the archives when her computer screen flickered. A message appeared that she did not understand at first. It said that authorization had been accepted and that the sleeper protocol had been initiated. Then it said that the fleet was awakening. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she grabbed her coat and ran out of the building. Across human territory, the same scene was playing out in different ways. On colony worlds and space stations and orbital platforms, hidden systems were coming online. Power generators that had been dormant for centuries began to hum with energy. Doors that had been sealed opened for the first time in living memory. On the planet called New Haven, a farmer named George Carter was working in his field when the ground began to shake. He dropped his tools and watched in amazement as a section of the nearby hillside slid away to reveal a massive metal door. The door was covered with old symbols and warnings in languages he did not recognize. As he watched, the door slowly opened and bright lights spilled out from inside. He walked toward the opening and looked inside. What he saw made him fall to his knees. Inside the hidden chamber was a ship, but it was not like any ship he had ever seen. It was enormous and covered with weapons platforms and armored plates. It looked like something from a nightmare, something designed for one purpose and one purpose only. It was a machine built to destroy. The ship's engines were already warming up. Lights were blinking across its hull as ancient systems came back to life. A mechanical voice echoed through the chamber, announcing that the vessel was preparing for launch. George scrambled backward as the ship began to rise from its resting place. Similar scenes were happening all across human space. On a moon orbiting Jupiter, a hidden shipyard opened its doors and released 12 massive dreadnoughts that had been waiting in the darkness for generations. Near the border of human territory, a weapons platform the size of a small city powered up its main cannon for the first time in 2 centuries. In orbit around Earth itself, a ring of defense satellites activated and turned their sensors toward the incoming threat. Admiral received reports from across the fleet as the Sleeper Protocol continued its work. Each report was more incredible than the last. He had known that humanity had hidden weapons, but he had never imagined the scale of what his ancestors had built. There were ships in those hidden facilities that dwarfed anything the modern Navy possessed, weapons that could crack planets, automated fighters by the thousands. It was an arsenal designed to fight a war against the entire galaxy if necessary. He opened a communication channel to Earth and spoke with Secretary of Defense Grant. Was a heavy-set man with worried eyes who had never expected to face a crisis like this during his time in office. He asked how long until the awakening ships could reach the enemy fleet. Jack told him the full deployment would take 12 hours. The ships would reach in 18 hours. New Portland had civilian defense systems that might hold for 24 hours if they were lucky. Nodded slowly. He asked if the old weapons would work after being dormant for so long. Jack said they would. The people who built them had designed them to last forever. They had known that someday humanity might need them again. They had prepared for this moment even though they hoped it would never come. On New Portland, the 12 million colonists were being moved to underground shelters. Governor Holmes coordinated the evacuation from her office in the capital city. She was a calm woman who had led the colony for 15 years. She had never faced anything like this before, but she kept her voice steady as she gave orders and organized the response. Her assistant rushed in and told her that the planetary defense grid was coming online. Asked what defense grid. The assistant showed her a screen filled with data about weapons platforms and shield generators that had been hidden beneath the planet's surface since the colony was founded. Stared at the screen and realized that even she had not known what was buried beneath her world. The people who founded New Portland had prepared for this day. They had built defenses that could hold off an invasion fleet long enough for help to arrive. And now that help was on its way. Across the void of space, the fleet continued toward its target. Supreme Commander had no idea what was coming for him. He did not know about the ancient weapons or the hidden ships or the fury that humanity had kept locked away for 300 years. He was about to learn. The fleet arrived at New Portland expecting an easy victory. Supreme Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the planet grow larger on his. It was a beautiful world with blue oceans and green continents and white clouds drifting across its surface. Soon it would belong to the Dominion. Soon its people would serve new masters. He ordered his fleet to begin the attack. The first wave of fighters launched from the carrier ships and streaked toward the planet. Behind them came the bombers loaded with weapons designed to destroy cities. The capital ships moved into bombardment positions and prepared to fire on the surface, or expected the whole thing to be over in a few hours. He had done this many times before on other worlds. The pattern was always the same. Overwhelm the defenses, break the resistance, accept the surrender. But this time, something different happened. As the first fighters approached the planet, a network of hidden platforms rose from beneath the surface. They had been buried in the oceans and mountains and deserts for over a century waiting for this moment. Each platform carried weapons that they had never seen before. Energy cannons that fired beams of pure heat. Missile launchers loaded with warheads that could track and destroy any target. Point defense systems that could shoot down incoming fire with perfect accuracy. The first wave of fighters was destroyed in seconds. The bombers behind them lasted only slightly longer. The capital ships opened fire on the planet, but their weapons splashed harmlessly against shields that had appeared from nowhere. The shields covered the entire inhabited region of the planet and glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to absorb every attack. or stared at his tactical display and felt the first hint of doubt creep into his mind. This was not what he had expected. These were not the defenses of a weak and primitive species. These were the defenses of a civilization that knew how to fight. He ordered his fleet to continue the attack. More fighters launched. More bombers flew toward the surface. More capital ships added their firepower to the bombardment. For 6 hours, they hammered at New Portland with everything they had. They lost ship after ship to the planetary weapons. They watched their fighters explode before they could reach their targets. They saw their bombs and missiles vanish against the impenetrable shields. By the time the sensors detected the approaching human fleet, or had lost nearly a third of his forces, he had not managed to land a single soldier on the surface. The planet he had expected to conquer in hours was still standing untouched behind its shields. Then he saw what was coming, and his doubt turned to fear. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. The flagship alone was larger than anything or had ever seen. It was a dreadnought of impossible size covered with weapons platforms and armor plates that gleamed in the light of distant stars. Behind it came hundreds of other warships, each one bristling with cannons and missile launchers and systems that they could not identify, or had studied human military capabilities before the invasion. He had reviewed all the intelligence reports. He knew exactly how many ships humanity was supposed to have and how powerful their weapons were supposed to be. What he was seeing now did not match any of that information. This fleet should not exist. These weapons should not be possible. On the bridge of the dreadnought called the Resolute, Commander Amy watched the fleet scramble into defensive formation. She was 34 years old with short dark hair and her grandfather's tired eyes. She had trained her entire life for a moment she hoped would never come. Now that it was here, she felt nothing but cold determination. She opened a communication channel and broadcast a message to the enemy fleet. She identified herself and told them that their supreme commander had been given a chance to turn back. She said he had chosen not to listen. She told them that now they would learn what humanity truly was. Then she turned to her tactical officer and gave the order. She said all ships were free to fire. She said there would be no survivors. The human fleet attacked with precision and fury. Weapons that had been designed 2 centuries ago proved they had lost none of their power. Energy beams cut through shields like they were not there. Missiles locked onto targets and chased them across the battlefield. Automated fighter swarms launched from carrier ships and overwhelmed enemy defenses with sheer numbers. They tried to fight back. They launched their own fighters and fired their own weapons and attempted to organize a defense, but they were outmatched in every way. Their shields could not stop human weapons. Their armor could not protect them. Their fighters were too slow and their tactics were too predictable. Or watched his fleet die around him and finally understood the truth. The warnings had been real. The legends about human weapons had been true. For 300 years, humanity had hidden its true power behind a simple message, and the galaxy had been foolish enough to believe it was a bluff. He tried to send a retreat order, but his communications were jammed. He tried to maneuver his flagship to safety, but human ships blocked every escape route. One by one, the vessels were destroyed until only the flagship remained. Amy studied the enemy command ship on her display. Inside that vessel was the being who had ordered the attack on New Portland, the being who had dismissed humanity's warnings, the being who had thought he could conquer her people. She gave the order to fire. The main cannon of the Resolute powered up and released a beam of energy so bright that it lit up the entire battlefield. The beam struck Or's flagship and burned through its shields and armor in an instant. The ship exploded in a ball of fire that was visible from the surface of New Portland. The battle was over. The invasion had been stopped, and the galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget. Humanity had never been bluffing. The destruction of the fleet took less than 3 hours. When it was over, there was nothing left but debris drifting through space. 47 capital ships and 200 support vessels had been reduced to scattered metal and fatting heat signatures. 47,000 warriors had died in the battle. Not a single human ship had been lost. Commander Amy stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched the cleanup crews begin their work. Salvage drones moved through the wreckage collecting pieces that might be useful for study. Medical ships searched for any survivors, though none were expected to be found. The battle had been complete and total. The victory had been absolute. She should have felt proud. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt empty and tired and sad. This was not the future her grandparents had wanted for humanity. They had hidden these weapons, hoping they would never be needed. They had prayed that the galaxy would respect their borders and leave them in peace. That prayer had finally been answered with violence. Back on Earth, the Emergency Council gathered in a secure chamber beneath the capital city. Representatives from every human world attended either in person or through video connection. They had all seen the footage from New Portland. They had watched the awakening ships emerge from their hiding places. They knew that everything had changed. Admiral Jack addressed the assembly first. He was still aboard his ship near the battle site, but his face appeared on screens throughout the chamber. He spoke in a calm voice that hid the weight he felt in his heart. He told them that the secret was out. For 300 years, humanity had hidden its true capabilities behind warnings and borders. They had shown the galaxy only a small fraction of their power. They had hoped that would be enough to keep them safe. Now they had forced them to reveal everything. Secretary of Defense Grant stood and spoke next. He reminded everyone that the Dominion was not finished. They still controlled 7 species and dozens of worlds. They had lost 1 fleet, but they could build more. When word of this defeat reached there, they would be angry. They would want revenge. They would come back with everything they had. The chamber fell silent as everyone considered his words. Then Senator Lisa rose from her seat and proposed a solution that made many people uncomfortable. She said humanity should not wait for the Dominion to attack again. She said they should take the fight to the enemy. With their awakened fleet, they could reach thee in a month. They could end the threat permanently before it had a chance to grow. Several representatives voiced their agreement. They had shown they could not be trusted to respect boundaries. They had proven they were willing to attack civilian worlds. Why should humanity give them time to recover and plan another invasion? But others disagreed. Dr. Palmer had been brought to the council to provide historical context. She stood and reminded everyone why the weapons had been sealed away in the first place. Humanity had built those ships and cannons during a dark time in their history. They had been fighting for survival against enemies who wanted to destroy them. They had done terrible things in those wars, things they were ashamed of. When the wars ended, they had promised themselves they would never become conquerors. She asked the council if they really wanted to break that promise. She asked if they wanted to become the monsters they had fought so hard not to be. The debate continued for hours. Arguments were made on both sides. Some wanted aggressive action. Others wanted restraint. The fate of humanity and perhaps the entire galaxy hung in the balance. Finally, Admiral spoke again. He had been listening to every word and considering every point. Now he offered a different path forward. He said they did not need to conquer anyone. They did not need to destroy the civilization or occupy their worlds. They just needed to make sure that everyone understood the consequences of crossing humanity, not defeat, extinction. He proposed letting the few survivors from support ships go home. Let them tell their people what happened. Let the story spread across the galaxy. Let every species learn that human space was forbidden territory. Let them understand that the warnings were real and the consequences were final. The council voted and the decision was made. Humanity would not pursue the war. They would not attack the Dominion, but they would make their position absolutely clear. Any ship that entered human space without permission would be destroyed. Any fleet that threatened their people would be annihilated. There would be no warnings beyond the one that already existed. There would be no second chances. On New Portland, the shields came down, and the people emerged from their shelters. Governor Holmes gave a speech thanking the Navy for their protection. She stood in front of the Capitol building with the setting sun behind her and promised that the colony would rebuild and grow stronger. The 12 million people of New Portland looked up at the sky and saw the distant flashes of the cleanup operation still. They had come within hours of destruction. They had been saved by weapons they never knew existed. They were grateful and relieved, and also a little bit frightened by what they had learned about their own species. Commander Amy received orders to join the new border patrol. The awakened fleet would remain active and visible from now on. No more hiding. No more pretending to be weak. Humanity would show its true face to the galaxy and dare anyone to test them again. She set course for the border and watched the stars stream past her. Somewhere out there, the survivors of the fleet were racing home to deliver their terrible news. Soon, everyone would know. Soon the whole galaxy would understand. Human space was not to be crossed. Not today. Not ever. And anyone who tried would share the fate of Supreme Commander Orr. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiation. There would only be the absolute destruction of anyone foolish enough to ignore the warning. This was not a threat. This was a promise. 1 year had passed since the Battle of New Portland. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Old alliances had crumbled. Ancient powers had retreated into silence. And everywhere the same story was whispered in fear and wonder. The story of what happened when someone finally crossed human space. Ambassador Cole stood in the center of the Galactic Assembly on the neutral world of Prime. He was a tall man with graying hair and a calm face that revealed nothing of what he felt inside. Behind him, the blue and white flag of the United Human Worlds hung motionless in the still air of the chamber. Representatives from 47 spacefaring species filled the seats around him. They had come from every corner of the galaxy to hear what humanity had to say. Some of them were old enemies of the who were secretly pleased by the Dominion's defeat. Others were former allies who now worried about their own safety. All of them watched the human ambassador with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The representatives were notably absent. Their civilization had not collapsed after the battle, but it had withdrawn to its core worlds and gone quiet. Traders who visited their space brought back reports of a people in shock. The mighty Dominion that had conquered half the galaxy could not accept what had happened. They could not understand how they had been so completely defeated by a species they had dismissed as weak and primitive. Cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was calm and carried to every corner of the vast chamber. He said that for 3 centuries humanity had asked only one thing of the galaxy. They had asked to be left alone. They had not wanted to conquer other worlds or demand tribute from weaker species. They had simply drawn a line around their territory and asked that the line be respected. He paused and looked around the chamber at all the alien faces watching him. He continued by saying that they had chosen to cross that line. They had believed the warnings were empty threats. They thought humanity was bluffing. They sent their greatest fleet to conquer a peaceful human colony. His voice grew harder as he described what happened next. 47,000 warriors had learned the truth in the fires above New Portland. They had discovered that humanity was not weak. They had learned that the warnings were real, and they had paid for that lesson with their lives. A murmur ran through the assembly, raised his hand and waited for silence. He told them that humanity did not want war. They never had. The weapons they revealed had been built during a darker time in their history, a time of desperation when survival was not certain. They had sealed those weapons away because they hoped they would never need them again. They had hoped the galaxy would respect their boundaries without ever seeing what lay behind them. His expression grew cold as he delivered the final message. That hope had been tested. It would not be tested again. From this day forward, humanity's borders would be patrolled by the full strength of their awakened fleet. Any ship that entered their space without permission would be destroyed. Any fleet that threatened their people would be annihilated. There would be no negotiation. There would be no second chances. This was not open for discussion. He stepped back from the podium and let his words settle over the assembly like a heavy blanket. Far away on the bridge of the Sentinel, Admiral Jack watched the broadcast with his crew. He had served in the Navy for over 40 years. He had always believed that peace was possible if both sides were willing to work for it. Now he was not so sure. The galaxy had shown what it thought of peaceful species. It had sent warships to conquer them. He allowed himself a small, sad smile. His ancestors had been wiser than he gave them credit for. They had known that peace required strength. They had built weapons terrible enough to protect their children for generations, and they had hidden those weapons so that humanity could live as a peaceful species without being seen as a threat. Now the hiding was over. Now everyone knew what humanity was capable of. The question was whether the galaxy would be wise enough to leave them alone. On New Portland, the colony had been rebuilt. The scars of the battle were healing. New buildings rose where old ones had stood. Parks and gardens returned to the places where people had sheltered during the attack. Life was returning to normal, or at least as normal as things could be after what had happened. Commander Amy had taken a leave of absence from the Navy. She sat in her apartment in the capital city and held her newborn daughter in her arms. The baby had been born 3 months after the battle. She had her mother's dark hair and her great-grandfather's tired eyes. Amy watched the ambassador's speech on her screen and thought about the future. Her daughter would grow up in a galaxy that feared humanity. She would learn about the Battle of New Portland in school. She would know that her species had hidden terrible weapons for centuries and had finally been forced to use them. Was that a burden or a gift? Amy did not know. She only knew that her daughter would be safe. No one would threaten human space again, not after what happened to the... She whispered to her sleeping child that the galaxy knew now. They knew what humanity was, and maybe they would be wise enough to leave them alone. Across human space, 12 billion people looked up at the stars and hoped for the same thing. They did not want to fight. They did not want to conquer. They only wanted to live their lives in peace and raise their children and build their futures. But if anyone threatened them again, they would respond with all the fury their ancestors had prepared for them. The ancient weapons remained ready in their hidden facilities. The awakened fleet patrolled the borders with vigilance. The warning still played on every frequency for any ship that came near. Turn back, this is your only warning. The galaxy had finally learned that humanity meant every word. And deep in the darkness of space, the stars continued to shine on a species that had chosen peace, but was always prepared for war. The story was over, but the warning would echo through the galaxy forever. No one would ever cross human space again.